A frigid December wind swept across a temporary command post near the front lines in 1944. In the biting cold, General Omar Nelson Bradley, known for his calm demeanor, stepped outside to check on a group of enlisted men. According to one of them, who later wrote home about the encounter, Bradley quietly asked if they had enough blankets and warm coffee, then proceeded to help resecure a flapping tent flap. It wasn't the triumphant gesture of a swashbuckling officer charging into battle. It was the gentle act of a leader who cared about the welfare of his troops. Long after the war's end, the men remembered how that small moment spoke volumes. He had this quiet presence, like a caring uncle, the soldier said, but beneath it, you knew there was a formidable general. That striking blend of humanity and strategic brilliance came to define Omar Bradley. He was the man who, in a war often overshadowed by colossal personalities, won the respect of ordinary GIs by treating them with dignity, while orchestrating some of the Allies' most pivotal moves in the Western Front. Bradley's story begins much earlier, in the modest community of Clark, Missouri, on February 12, 1893. America was still finding its footing in the post-Civil War era. The West was being rapidly settled, and industrialization was reshaping the economy. While Clark was hardly a bustling metropolis, it offered a straightforward upbringing built around farm work, church on Sundays, and strong family ties. Bradley's father, John, worked as a school teacher and occasional laborer. His mother, Sarah, tended the household. From them, young Omar absorbed the virtues of humility, discipline, and the idea that quiet kindness could go hand in hand with strong convictions. Neighbors described the Bradley family as well-respected but far from wealthy. Omar himself was known to do chores for older folks in the community, usually refusing any payment. Even as a child, he showed a shy courtesy that never quite left him. With the dawn of the 20th century, the United States found itself increasingly pulled onto the world stage, from the Spanish-American War to mounting tensions in Europe. In 1911, after excelling in local schools, Bradley earned an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Stepping onto those storied grounds was a transformative experience. Surrounded by cadets from more privileged backgrounds, the unassuming Missouri farm boy carried a sense that he had to prove himself, and he did. While he wasn't the top of his class academically, he showed remarkable consistency, a methodical approach to tasks, and a reliability that instructors appreciated. He also participated in sports, though not as a star athlete. He simply valued teamwork and grit. Classmates later recalled his unpretentious nature. If others blustered about their own achievements, Bradley would quietly change the subject. Even in these early days, people sensed that behind his mild exterior lay a disciplined mind suited for command. Bradley graduated in 1915 from what has famously been called the class the stars fell on, a reference to the many future generals it produced, including Dwight D. Eisenhower. The outbreak of World War I in Europe offered new officers like Bradley a chance to find their footing. But by the time the U.S. joined in 1917, his assignments kept him stateside. He wanted to see combat in France, but fate had him training new recruits instead. It wasn't the glamorous experience he might have hoped for, but he applied himself diligently, teaching marksmanship and basic infantry tactics. He recognized that shaping raw volunteers into capable soldiers was no small responsibility. In personal letters, he admitted occasional frustration at not being where the action is, but reasoned that a soldier's duty is to serve wherever needed. After the war, the Army reduced in size, a common pattern during peacetime. Bradley, now a dedicated officer, cycled through various postings, including teaching at West Point and later attending the infantry school at Fort Benning. There he grew close to several contemporaries who would later become central figures in World War II. The interwar years were a period of reflection and professional growth. He married Mary Elizabeth Quayle in 1916, and their partnership provided emotional grounding amid the uncertainties of Army life. Letters between them speak of a gentle, supportive dynamic. She encouraged his quiet ambitions and offered solace whenever he felt overshadowed by more flamboyant officers. They shared a modest dream: raise a family, see the world, and serve their country with honor. By the 1930s, political unrest in Europe and Asia signaled storms on the horizon. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, rearming the nation and threatening neighboring territories. Japan advanced through parts of China. Meanwhile, the U.S. still reeled from the Great Depression, focusing mainly on domestic recovery rather than overseas concerns. However, men like Bradley, who studied tactical developments, suspected that another large-scale conflict might be inevitable. He followed news of German blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France with professional concern, analyzing how outdated American doctrines might fare against modern panzer divisions. As tensions escalated, the U.S. began to rebuild its military. Officers who had patiently served through budget cuts and stagnation were now thrust into high responsibility as the country prepared for what would become World War II. When the United States formally entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Army was in dire need of leadership to expand, train, and equip millions of new draftees. Bradley's solid reputation for efficiency and fairness made him a prime candidate for commanding training centers. At first, he served under General George C. Marshall, helping to streamline how new troops were processed, taught, and deployed. That position carried huge responsibility, though it again kept him away from direct combat. In 1942, however, events took a critical turn. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who knew Bradley from West Point days, recognized his organizational talent and calm under pressure. He asked Bradley to help shape the Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. Bradley traveled there as General George Patton's subordinate, observing the gritty reality of desert warfare. In early 1943, after American forces suffered a bruising defeat at Kasserine Pass, Patton took charge of the battered Second Corps, and Bradley served as his deputy. Patton's brash style contrasted with Bradley's subdued approach, but they worked effectively together. Over time, with Patton's impetus and Bradley's managerial skill, the Second Corps rebounded, driving Axis forces from North Africa. Bradley's role was often behind the scenes, coordinating supplies, ensuring lines of communication, advising on operational details. His superiors noticed how, despite the chaos of desert operations and the flamboyance of certain generals, Bradley kept a steady focus on soldiers' well-being. He made a point of visiting field hospitals, talking quietly to wounded men, and pushing for better rations. Troops began calling him the GI's general because he spoke to them more like a concerned mentor than a distant commander. As the Allied campaign turned toward Sicily in mid-1943, Bradley rose to a corps command of his own. Under Patton's 7th Army and Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army, the Allies fought to seize the strategic island. Bradley's methods emphasized careful planning, thorough reconnaissance, and a willingness to adapt swiftly on the battlefield. Though overshadowed in headlines by Patton's sometimes sensational actions, like racing to capture Messina first, Bradley proved indispensable. His corps advanced methodically, limiting casualties where possible. His subordinates valued that human-centric approach, feeling that while he demanded discipline, he never asked them to carry out reckless gambles. The success in Sicily propelled him to a larger stage, planning the invasion of Normandy. The Allies recognized that once they landed in France, the manpower and resource demands would be staggering. Bradley was given command of the 1st U.S. Army, which would land on Omaha and Utah beaches. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, as thousands of GIs stormed ashore in one of history's largest amphibious assaults, Bradley directed the land operations from an offshore ship, tension etched on his face. The carnage at Omaha Beach was worse than planners predicted, with thick German defenses nearly pinning down the assault. Some eyewitnesses described how Bradley, upon learning of the heavy losses, wore an expression of pained determination. He refused to consider calling off the landing, believing the cost, though terrible, was necessary to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe. Yet behind that tough decision, colleagues sensed a man who grieved each life lost. Once the Allies pushed inland, Bradley's role amplified. He oversaw the broader move through the hedgerows of Normandy, orchestrating offensives that eventually pierced German lines. His style was pragmatic, trusting subordinates, encouraging initiative, and focusing on coordination among infantry, tanks, and artillery. He rarely sought personal glory, leaning on others like Generals Leonard T. Jarrow and J. Lawton Collins to lead from the front. This humility worked wonders for morale. If something went awry, Bradley took responsibility rather than shifting blame. He believed that bridging the gap between command and rank-and-file soldiers was key to success, especially in labyrinthine hedgerow fighting. In July 1944, once the Normandy breakout began, Bradley took command of the newly formed 12th Army Group, the largest American field command of the war. Over 1 million U.S. troops would eventually operate under him, making it one of the most significant commands in history. The demands were enormous: strategizing breakthroughs, mitigating supply issues, coordinating with British and Canadian armies. At times, strategic disagreements arose with General Montgomery, or the flamboyant Patton, who led one of the armies under Bradley's overall umbrella. Though tensions flared, Patton craved a lightning push deep into Germany, while Montgomery insisted on a single thrust. Bradley's calm leadership kept things from devolving into chaos. He skillfully balanced competing egos and operational necessities. Yet the Normandy campaign also saw controversy. Some critics cite the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where a portion of German forces escaped encirclement. They argue that if Bradley, Patton, and Montgomery had been more aggressive or better synchronized, they could have sealed off the retreat entirely. Others note that even partial success inflicted massive damage on the Germans, hastening the war's end. Bradley later admitted that the Falaise Gap was a near miss, though he contested that real-time confusion and shifting front lines made a perfect encirclement difficult. In a quiet reflection years later, he wrote that war planning is never as neat as critics imagine, especially when thousands of lives hang in the balance. As the Allies raced across France, morale soared, but the war was far from over. In December 1944, the Germans launched their final major offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Bradley's 12th Army Group bore the brunt, with the 101st Airborne famously encircled in Bastogne. Some panicked staffers urged a strategic withdrawal, but Bradley insisted on reinforcing and stabilizing the line. His confidence in the frontline troops, combined with a calm approach to crisis management, rallied the Allies. Eventually, General Patton's Third Army pivoted north to relieve Bastogne, dealing a critical blow to Hitler's desperate gamble. Bradley, for his part, was credited with maintaining coherence in the overall Allied posture, preventing the Bulge from turning catastrophic. For many GIs, Bradley's visits to forward areas stood out. He would arrive unannounced, slip past piles of rations, and talked to small groups of soldiers, occasionally kneeling in the mud to examine a map with a platoon leader. He asked about their families, their injuries, their hopes for after the war. This personal touch was something other generals seldom matched. It sprouted from Bradley's own experiences in modest Missouri. Plus, his firm conviction that a good commander never grows distant from the realities of the men carrying out his orders. Letters from infantrymen to their loved ones sometimes mentioned a brief exchange with old Brad, describing him as polite, serious, and surprisingly empathetic for a top general in a savage war. The final months of the conflict saw Bradley's forces pushing into Germany, overrunning Nazi defenses, and liberating concentration camps. The horrors uncovered in these camps shook the troops to their core. Bradley himself visited some of these sites, voicing grief and anger at the atrocities. He believed that their sacrifices had helped end a regime that brought unspeakable suffering. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe ended, though the cost had been staggering. Bradley found himself lauded as a hero, second in public renown only to men like Eisenhower or Patton. However, true to character, he avoided flamboyant celebrations and instead spoke about rebuilding Europe and caring for displaced persons. Post-war, Bradley faced new challenges. He took charge of the Veterans Administration, striving to handle the benefits and care of millions returning from service. Under his leadership, the VA expanded programs like the GI Bill, which offered education and housing loans. Bradley felt a personal stake in helping these veterans transition to civilian life, having witnessed their bravery and sacrifice firsthand. He also believed that preventing another war depended on how societies treated those who'd borne the last conflict's burden. Despite bureaucratic tangles, he poured energy into making the VA more effective, though it was an uphill battle with limited resources. Those who worked under him recall that he applied the same empathetic style to bureaucratic leadership, focusing on collaboration and trusting specialists in each area. In 1948, Bradley was named Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, playing a pivotal role in adapting the force for the atomic age and the early rumbling of what would become the Cold War. Then in 1949, he was appointed the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presiding over crucial decisions such as the initial steps of U.S. involvement in the Korean War. His stance emphasized that the world's new tensions demanded cautious but firm engagement. Though overshadowed by flamboyant personalities like General Douglas MacArthur, Bradley's counsel often balanced strategic aggression with a deep awareness of potential costs. He famously argued against escalating the Korean conflict into a broader war with China, describing such expansion as the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time, illustrating once again his pragmatic approach to strategy. Away from the limelight of official duty, Omar Bradley's personal life remained anchored in devotion to Mary, his wife of many decades. They had one daughter, Elizabeth. Mary provided a stable home front, especially given Bradley's hectic travel schedule and high-level meetings. Letters between them show affectionate banter and mutual respect. Mary, though never seeking public attention, acted as a calming influence whenever Bradley dealt with political disputes or disputes with more forceful personalities. They enjoyed quieter moments at a modest home in Virginia, hosting barbecues for close friends, or reading side by side. That sense of normalcy offered relief from his high-stakes responsibilities. Over time, Bradley also reconnected with siblings and relatives in Missouri, occasionally traveling to see them. He might have been a national figure, but he hadn't forgotten his small-town roots. Throughout his career, controversies cropped up around certain decisions. Critics questioned whether he was too accommodating to politicians, or if his measured personality caused him to hold back against more audacious generals, sometimes letting them overshadow him. There was also occasional friction with Patton. Bradley admired Patton's drive, yet found his impulsiveness risky. Historians debate whether Bradley missed chances to end campaigns faster, especially in the Falaise Gap fiasco, or whether circumstances simply conspired against a perfect encirclement. Allies who worked with him insisted that Bradley's deliberate manner avoided reckless maneuvers that could have cost even more casualties. Over the years, such debates continued, illustrating the complexity of leading a massive multinational force in a war with no simple playbook. Bradley's achievements, though overshadowed by the colorful personalities of the war, shaped the outcome in Europe and the post-war American military. His brand of leadership influenced how future generations of officers approached their roles, balancing aggression with caution, cunning with empathy. Many found his example refreshing in an era where generals often soared to fame via dramatic gestures. Bradley quietly believed that a commander's success was measured less by personal glory and more by how many of his soldiers survived to see peace. This common man's general ethos endeared him to GIs and left a lasting imprint on the Army's institutional memory. In his later years, Bradley authored A Soldier's Story, reflecting on World War II's events and giving readers an inside view of major decisions and daily experiences. He remained mostly private about personal hardships, such as the emotional toll of sending men into battle or witnessing entire towns obliterated. People close to him said he carried regrets and sorrow over casualties, especially at places like Omaha Beach. Occasionally, he acknowledged the weight on your conscience, knowing that each command might be a life and death matter. That depth of care might be one reason he's remembered for his humane approach, placing as much importance on the welfare of his troops as on the strategic scoreboard. In 1965, Mary passed away, a devastating loss for Bradley. Friends worried he might retreat entirely from public life, but after a period of mourning, he found comfort in close family and eventually remarried. Despite partial withdrawal from the limelight, he still wrote letters of advice to younger military leaders and occasionally attended official events. The final phase of his life saw him recognized with honors, tributes, and the respect of peers, many of whom credited him with orchestrating crucial Allied victories. In the 1970s, as the Vietnam War concluded, a new generation of Americans reevaluated their military past. Bradley's name surfaced in discussions about ethical leadership, with some seeing him as an example of how a general should prioritize the soldier's well-being. He never glorified warfare, treating it instead as a grim necessity demanded by the times. Omar Nelson Bradley died on April 8, 1981, at the age of 88. Tributes poured in from veterans groups, political leaders, and everyday citizens who recalled him not only as a figure from black and white war photos, but also as a moral anchor during a turbulent era. At his funeral, the prevailing theme was that he guided men through the darkest moments without losing sight of their humanity. Eulogies emphasized that while the conflict required steel and determination, Bradley had also embodied compassion, a reminder that war, for all its brutality, could still hold room for empathy. Why should modern audiences care about Omar Bradley's life? Because it illustrates the possibility of leading with a moral core intact. He wasn't immune to mistakes or controversy, but he approached the most violent chapters of history with an insistence on decency. He gave instructions not just on attacking enemy lines, but on limiting unnecessary risk to his men. This focus on human dignity resonates especially in an age where technology might make warfare more impersonal. Bradley's story teaches that behind every strategic plan are soldiers with families, dreams, and fears. His approach, combining operational skill with genuine concern for individual troops, remains a blueprint for leadership under pressure, whether in the military or any large-scale endeavor. In a more profound sense, Bradley's legacy confronts us with the ethical dilemmas inherent in warfare. As he advanced through France, the Low Countries, and into Germany, each order meant life or death for thousands. He neither exulted in that power nor collapsed under its weight. Instead, he navigated it with a humble sense of duty, consistently reminding those around him that victory was not a personal triumph, but a shared necessity for stopping a destructive regime. Even after the guns fell silent, his new mission became caring for veterans. He recognized that the aftermath of war doesn't end with a peace treaty. It lives on in the minds of those who fought, as well as in the institutions that must support them. Reflecting on Omar Bradley's full journey, from a small-town boy in Missouri to the quiet powerhouse behind the Western Front's success, can stir gratitude and introspection. He exemplified the tension between the demands of large-scale war and the moral imperative to safeguard as many lives as possible. His compassion showed that aggression needn't be the sole hallmark of a great general. Empathy can be equally potent in motivating armies and forging alliances. As we close this story of Omar Bradley, we might imagine him, near the end of his life, sitting in a modest living room, an old army map spread before him, pointing out locations where he once paced in frustration or gave final go-aheads to major offensives. Perhaps he'd recall the men who never returned, or the times he stood under drizzling rain in Normandy, mourning a lost battalion. Maybe he'd mention how each strategic choice felt personal, shaped by the knowledge that living, breathing individuals would bear the brunt. And yet he carried on, believing that moral clarity and thorough planning could reduce the ravages of war. Omar Bradley's story thus nudges us to remember that in even the darkest theaters of conflict, decency can still guide decisions, and that leadership is as much about the heart as the mind.